Good evening and welcome to another weekly edition of the American Family Association Presents. The AFA is a national organization devoted to strengthening the American family, the very foundation of our civilization. Tonight's topic is Dear Children, and our host is Frank Russo, State Director of the AFA of New York. And now, our host, Frank Russo.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going to tell you a true story. It's a very moving story about some men and women who made terrible decisions early in their lives. After you watch the video, if you have any questions, give us a call. And now our video entitled, Dear Children.
To my eldest child, to think you are almost 12 now. As the eldest, I write to you and hope you will help the 3 younger children understand. At 10, 9, and 7, they may have some questions you'll be able to answer for them. Being on your own for so long, children, I know hasn't been easy for you. You're probably wondering why I've taken so long to write, or where I've been all along, or why I bothered to write now. Well, I'm going to answer this for you. I haven't written before because I'd only been concerned for myself for the better part of my life.
Her name is Michelle. On this night, words that have escaped her for 12 years flow across the page. All across America today, there are tens of thousands of Michelles, perhaps more, who have similar stories. While this story is hers, it may be true in some way for all of us. For this is a story about abortion, and believe it or not, all of us in some way or another have been touched by abortion. Maybe as a mother of an aborted child, or perhaps as a father, a grandparent, a brother or sister, or just as a friend. Some of us have already experienced healing. Others may still be facing the trauma associated with abortion. But wherever you are right now, our purpose is to help ease any pain you may be feeling. For this is a story about faith, hope, and love. Michelle, like most teenagers starting high school, felt lost and frightened, unsure of herself. Instead of establishing her own identity, she began to look for ways to please others. She began to experiment heavily with drugs and alcohol, and she used sex to gain acceptance among her peers. As a 15-year-old freshman, Michelle met a 20-year-old and became sexually active. Within just a few months, she discovered she was pregnant.
At first, I didn't want to believe it. I'd never been pregnant before, so I wasn't sure. And I didn't really want to face it. I didn't want to look at it. And I didn't want to tell my parents because they had shown concern in my behavior, but I had pretty well lied to them, convincing them that what they thought wasn't so, hiding my activities, and them wanting to believe the best of me, believe me. So I didn't want to tell them, and then they were right, and then I'd be caught in a lie on top of everything else, So I went to the boy and I told him I think I'm pregnant, and his mother said, well, I don't want him to get married. So here's this supposedly older woman that's supposed to be responsible, and I didn't feel I could go to my parents, so I went to her and to the boyfriend. And, they thought that, well, aren't you going to finish high school? How can you finish high school being pregnant? And so she called her OBGYN and made arrangements that I could have an abortion. So I really never made a choice. I just allowed it to happen to me.
Abortion. Suddenly, life seemed to be coming at Michelle hard and fast. She didn't understand what was happening to her, and she knew even less about the human life that was growing inside her body. She was scared, confused, and lonely. Abortion seemed to be the simple and logical solution. And so, acting on the advice of someone she hardly knew, someone who had only the best interests of the father in mind, Michelle would have her life dramatically altered. She would have an abortion.
I'd never been to an OBGYN, by the way. Never. And my first experience was having an abortion. And he checked me, and he came out and talked to the boy's mom and said, yeah, she's pregnant. And they discussed what the monetary compensation would be and who was going to pay it. And it was decided that she would pay it. And then he came back in and he said, I'm going to give you a local anesthetic. And he began to give me a DNC in the office. And it was excruciating. I sweated, my palms sweated. I had had nothing but a local anesthetic. And I began to cry, and I felt so alone. I just couldn't understand why I'd gotten to this point. Or how I got there. And then I was helpless. I remember feeling very helpless. And then when I came out, it's like all these things I felt, I just denied them. Because it was all over, and they said, how are you? And I said, I'm just fine. And I wasn't just fine. You know, just kept denying myself. You know, pleasing other people.
And it didn't stop. Michelle continued to self-destruct. She bounced in and out of more meaningless sexual encounters. She became pregnant a second time, and then a third, and finally a fourth. For each pregnancy, she decided on abortion. For Michelle, it seemed to be the easy way out, but with each abortion, her sense of reality diminished.
The harder I tried, the harder it got to pinpoint when I had the first or the second abortion. And now who was the father, you know? Did I love him? It was like constantly, it's bad enough that you make a wrong choice, but then you beat yourself over the head with it day in and day out. Trying to remember every little detail to make sure that what you did was right, and in your heart you know it was wrong.
Michelle didn't know it, but she was suffering from what therapists and mental health experts are now beginning to define as post-abortion syndrome, or PAS. Dr. Susan Harvath has counseled hundreds of people suffering from PAS. The youngest was 14, the oldest 80. A woman still trying to cope with her decision to abort her child more than 50 years ago.
In my experience, I see about 200 to 300 people a year. And those people come in a very delayed fashion. The symptoms don't really begin to occur sometimes to 8 to 10 years after the abortion. The problem is that the abortion itself is so horrific that the mind sets up a defense mechanism. It doesn't want to remember, so it just doesn't.
The symptoms of post-abortion syndrome include depression, eating and sleeping disorders, flashbacks, nightmares, loss of self-esteem, a spiritual divorce from God, bouts of crying and nagging, feelings of self-blame, sadness, anger, denial, guilt, and grief. What Dr. Harvath calls undeniable and prolonged grief.
A parent is a parent forever, even of a dead child. People who are post-abortive are truly grieving, but it's a different kind of grief. It's a very elusive grief. There's no focus, there's no object, there's no body to bury, there's no funeral, and there's no gravesite. So the grieving goes on and on and on.
Post-abortion syndrome also affects men. Abortion and its aftermath is every bit as devastating and emotionally paralyzing for the fathers of the aborted children as it is for the mothers.
There isn't a day that goes by where I don't think of that child at some point or another. And a lot of times I'll run across somebody that's got a child that's about the age mine would have been. And I'm always wondering, you know, what would mine have looked like?
Tom's abortion nightmare began when his girlfriend's parents convinced their daughter she should have an abortion rather than marry Tom.
I knew something wasn't right. And then she real quiet, like, just said that she was going to get an abortion. And the only thing that went through my head, it was the first thing and it was the only thing that just stuck with me, was she's going to kill my child.
Emotionally, Tom was stunned, trying frantically to save his unborn child. He filed suit to prevent his girlfriend from having the abortion, but court action was too slow. Before his case came up on the docket, his baby was gone.
If a couple, if their child is killed in an accident, they grieve for the child. But one thing that they're allowed to do that I wasn't allowed to do was to bury their child, have a funeral, say goodbye to them. But with abortion, it's you're not allowed to grieve. If you grieve, people think you're strange.
Tom and Gloria had what seemed to be an ideal marriage, the second for both. Their relationship was the envy of many of their friends. But then, Gloria became pregnant with their first child.
Since she already had a child and I had children from a previous marriage, that it wasn't really her idea, but it was my idea not to have any more children. And it reached a point where I told her I was going to leave her, divorce her, and I just forced her to have the abortion.
The pain, the anger and bitterness that followed the abortion cut like a knife through the heart of Tom and Gloria's marriage.
From the time that we went to the clinic, right up to the point that she even went in to have the abortion, I felt up to that point that I wasn't going to have to deal with anything. I thought that it was going to be, she was going to be in and out, and that was going to be the end of it.
But it wasn't the end. The abortion had changed their love relationship to something completely different.
And then when I came out and I saw him, as soon as I saw him, I mean instant, I hated him. I hated him so bad that I would have killed him. If I would have had a gun or a knife or anything, I really would have killed him.
It just looked like the life had been sucked out of her. She just wasn't the same woman that went in there as came out. And we probably didn't say 2 words the rest of the day to each other.
Everything broke down. I mean, our communication was gone, our sex life was gone, our fun. We had no fun. And we were just stuck with ourselves, and we didn't like ourselves, and we didn't like each other. So it was pretty shattered.
For 12 years, Ed carried the emotional pain of 2 abortions. Both times, first as a college student and later before his marriage to his wife, Morna. He knew abortion was wrong, but both times he willingly accepted the decision to abort the children. Morna's abortion was especially troubling.
I was afraid for Morna, what she was going to experience, and it was just like deja vu, you know, or thinking about the first time, and everything was just crowding in on me. And finally they called Morna's name. It was her turn, and I can remember as we sat there holding hands, feeling how afraid she was. And as she got up to go in the back room, I'll never forget the look in her eyes that was saying to me, Ed, do something, you know, don't let this happen. And I couldn't do anything. I just froze and watched her walk away. And there were tears in her eyes as she turned to go into that back room. And I mean, it just tore my heart out. We never talked about it for the next 4 years. And we each tried to deal with it in our own way. But it affected her drastically.
Denial and avoidance of an issue like abortion can provide some short-term protection for us. We find that people can't even remember the abortion clinic. They can't remember going there. They can't remember what was said to them. The denial mechanism is so strong that it simply brings down the curtain on that event in their life. Long-term denial of the abortion can create all sorts of problems.
Along with the guilt and grief, one of the most common problems in the women and men traumatized by their abortion experience seems to be a spiritual U-turn away from God. Inwardly, they seem to know it wasn't the choice they made, but what was chosen, the taking of the life of their child in a dramatically altered value system.
I mean, I didn't care. I mean, this was, I'm damned, I'm going to hell. There's no way back.
People who've had an abortion oftentimes shut God out of their lives. They feel that they've committed the unforgivable sin or that they've somehow done the unrightable wrong. What they fail to see is the love of God, the godliness of God, if you will. They see him instead as vengeful or unforgiving or impatient. What they fail to understand is that God not only can forgive us, but he does forgive us.
I felt like I had committed an unforgivable sin. And because of that, I stopped going to church. I didn't feel like I had a place in church. I didn't belong in there.
Forgiveness? I didn't even think about God anymore. I left him behind with the second abortion. You know, I hung him to the cross with the first.
Many people who've had abortions don't really understand the difference between forgiving and forgetting. Realistically, you're not going to forget an abortion experience. It's so painful. But forgiveness means letting go of that pain, that heartfelt, paralyzing pain, and going on with your life. The problem with post-abortive healing is that many people can't forgive themselves.
By age 20, Michelle's life had bottomed out. 4 pregnancies, 4 abortions. Her relationships were mostly brief sexual skirmishes. But one night in a bar, as she was ready to run out after what she would later call a real loser, an acquaintance in the crowd reached out and grabbed her arm.
And he says, "You don't need that." And I was just taken back, because at first I thought, who do you think you are? You know, this Bob, I hardly knew Bob. And I was offended. I thought, who do you think you are? But at the same time, inside, he was so right. And I pulled away from him, you know, and I ran out the door after this guy. But something happened to me that day, inside.
The emotional and spiritual scars of abortion run deep. Healing those scars can be a long and tedious process. But in abortion, healing includes rejecting the role of victim, examining your own situation, resolving to take control of your life, and finally, turning back to God, asking for his forgiveness and accepting it. For those who have lived through the trauma of abortion, their healing, their return to a state of good mental health, started when they began to recognize abortion for what it is, the killing of innocent unborn children. They began to accept their intense feelings of anger, guilt, and grief. The healing process seems to be completed when they finally come to terms with their lost children and with their God.
Healing means facing reality, accepting responsibility, and forgiving ourselves. Turning our lives back to God, not a mean and vengeful God, but a loving God. who has it in his power to forgive us, and who does forgive us.
I suffered a lot of mental anguish for many years, and it wasn't really until I was able to go to the Lord and get the forgiveness that I needed that I was able to deal with it.
I had to allow God to restore that relationship, and I had to let go of the resentment that I had.
The word healing means to return to a state of health. Many of us have never experienced that state, and returning to it really means learning about being healthy for the first time. In a spiritual sense, where some of us feel we are returning to our relationship with God, others of us may feel we are really just discovering it for the first time. I'm sure this notion must make God smile, because he's saying that he's always been there. Healing is discovering that.
I remember putting my arms around her, and the tears just started to flow out of both of us. And we stood there and we cried and, told each other how sorry we were about what had happened. And we started to pray to God and ask him to forgive us for what we had done.
I was trying to hang on to that baby, even though he was gone, dead. And it wasn't until I could start letting him go that I was able to start coming out of all of that.
I actually could feel God coming down and putting his hand on me and saying, not literally, but figuratively, and just saying, Ed, it's okay. That's all I've been waiting to hear, is that you were sorry. And it was like 12 years of guilt and garbage being taken off of me.
Michelle's journey through the trauma of abortion also took her back to God. Michelle eventually married Bob, the man who grabbed her arm in that bar. Pregnant with their first child, Michelle was home one weekend by herself when she cried out for forgiveness.
I didn't cry out for myself. I cried out for my baby. Because I was certain that God was a mean, vengeful God. And I sat on the edge of bed and I cried and I said, God, don't hurt my baby for what I have done. And in that I admitted that I was wrong. Because how could I think God would hurt my baby if I had done nothing wrong? And that was the first time I admitted that all my reason was useless, that all the so many years of my life were just in death, not life at all, but living away from God. And I was holding my belly and just praying for the first time in years, since freshman year in high school, and God comforted me, and inside my heart, I heard him tell me, it's okay, go to sleep. And I remember I was so moved that God had touched me that day. I remember knowing that he had touched me. He never left. I left, but God didn't. And I went right to sleep and never slept better. And that was the beginning of becoming a Christian again. That night was the beginning. God restoring me.
Michelle's journey back to God was not finished. Late one night, some months later, she had an urgent sense that she needed to write the children she never had, the 4 children she aborted more than 10 years ago.
I've thought about you every day. You were in my every prayer. I felt, too, you needed to know how much I love you. I know it must be hard for you to understand this, but I do. And my heart aches to behold your precious faces. So this, children, leads me to the reason I bothered to write in the first place. It is in my heart to ask you to please forgive me for aborting you. I'm sorry. I can only begin to guess of all the daily things I've deprived you of for denying you of life itself. I can hardly find words to describe how my heart breaks. It may be of little comfort to you to know, but I would give my life for you. Please find it in your heart to forgive me. Love, Mom. The answer was, we already have. It's okay. This is the cleansing. And I cry these tears with joy now, instead of sorrow. And this was just one of the many gifts that God has given me.
My experience has been that abortion, in one way or another, has touched all of our lives. As the mother of the aborted child, the father, or another relative, the pain can be extraordinary. But what I try to tell people is that this awful pain can be healed. There is a way to find help, and most importantly, there is hope.
If you or anyone you know needs help coping with the effects of post-abortion syndrome, there are people ready to help. To find someone near you, write the National Office of Post-Abortion Reconciliation and Healing, 3501 South Lake Drive, P.O. Box 07477, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Or call 1-800-5-WE-CARE. Those who have openly walked through the pain of abortion and openly confronted the anger, guilt, denial, and grief over their lost children have also discovered the overwhelming presence of God in their lives. A God who loves them, has forgiven them, and given them renewed hope.
A recent study in the British Medical Journal shows that women who have abortions are 500% more likely to commit suicide than women who give birth. Believe it or not, there are now some 40 million men and women in America who have actually killed their own children through abortion. The guilt caused by such an evil act is sure to take its toll. Keep them in your prayers. If you have any questions on the video or want to receive our free newsletter, give us a call. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.